Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are excited to have you all. Thanks for joining. My name is Elizabeth Orlan, and I'm the Associate Director of Research for the Global Health Advocacy Incubator. And today we present to you our webinar, Using UCSF's Food Industry Documents Archive to Support Healthy Food Policy Advocacy Efforts. We have a great set of panelists here today who have participated in our inaugural industry documents training last year, who will present their findings from the archive research and how they've used these documents for their advocacy. Today we have Dr. Laura Schmidt. Professor Schmidt is a professor in health policy in the School of Medicine at the University of California at San Francisco. Dr. Schmidt's central goal is to bridge the worlds of biomedical research, clinical practice, and population health in ways that help us better understand some of the most pressing issues in health and healthcare today. So before I yield the floor to Dr. Schmidt, just a couple of logistics. We have simultaneous translation available for this webinar. Your lines are on mute, but please feel free to ask any sort of questions in the Q&A box. And please enjoy our webinar. Over to you, Dr. Schmidt.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Industry Documents Library at UCSF and some of the ways that it can support advocacy efforts in the food policy space. Next slide. So this is a screenshot of the Industry Documents Library. We have several collections. It started with our tobacco collection. We have a pharmaceuticals collection, chemical collection, and of course, our food collection. Often, sorry about the video. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting it on. Hi. The Food Industry Documents Library is being showcased today. But it's important for users of the archive to know that we have relevant materials in all of the archives relevant to food. For example, I'll be demonstrating how we have a lot of information about food corporations in the tobacco collection because tobacco giants owned food subsidiaries for many, many years. Next slide. The library is available to anyone with an internet connection. You just Google UCSF Industry Documents Library, and it can be searched. There are convenient search instructions in the archive. So the first way that documents can support food policy advocacy is by just simply increasing transparency about who's who, where industry is playing a role in food policy debates in any country around the world. Next slide. So this is an example of a not very transparent industry organization. The International Life Sciences Institute is all over the world. It has 16 branches. It's wherever you are, it has a branch in your country. In some places around the world, ILSI has is very influential in food policy. For example, in China, ILSI is essentially setting obesity prevention policy for the country. ILSI is actually an industry front group. This is a screenshot from the ILSI website. And if you were to go onto this website, you would think, well, this is just a really nice organization, as it says, a nonprofit organization that's there to advance and disseminate science for the public benefit. You have to dig a lot deeper to understand that ILSI is actually a food industry front group. Scientists at ILSI also work for other industries such as the tobacco and chemical industries. But this is, we have many, many documents throughout the industry archives on ILC, and it's an important player that has been very influential worldwide in food policy debates, and it's good to know who they really are. Next slide. Another example of how documents can be useful is in exposing science that is being presented as neutral, but is actually backed by industry-funded industry players. So this is a very good example, a screenshot of clinicaltrials.gov of a very large study that's happening all over the world, the International Study of Childhood Obesity, Lifestyle, and the Environment, or ISCOL. Again, the Right to Know collection in the Food Industry Documents Library has a very substantial amount of materials about this study. It's funded by the Coca-Cola Corporation. And really the agenda here is to, they're studying 10-year-olds in 12 countries around the world. And really the agenda here is to make the case that physical activity is the problem in childhood obesity, lack of physical activity, not unhealthy diet. So that is a very standard industry talking point. And this is a study that you might read an article and think, oh, this is just neutral science. But in fact, it has an agenda behind it funded by Coca-Cola. Next slide. Another way that documents can be used by advocates to increase transparency is by exposing government officials that have ties to the food industry. This is a screenshot from the Coca-Cola website. It has the former director of the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Brenda Fitzgerald. While she was in office, was working quite closely with Coca-Cola food industry actors, as well as tobacco industry actors. Next slide. There are a number of documents in the collection that were donated by the advocacy organization, US Right to Know. US Right to Know used Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain documents on what was going on behind Brenda Fitzgerald's CDC, and was pretty influential in demonstrating her ties to the food industry. Next slide. Eventually, the work by US Right to Know and other investigative journalists wound up essentially outing Dr. Fitzgerald as a food industry actor, and eventually she was she stepped down. Next slide. So in addition to advocates being able to use the archive to increase transparency about who's who, where science is industry funded, front groups and such, the documents can help advocates understand the game plan that the industry has. Next slide. I often find that those of us in public health research and in the advocacy world have a different view of food policy than the industry does. And when you really do sustained analyses in the archives, you start to understand a different perspective on that the industry brings to food policy debates. One of the most important aspects of understanding the food and beverage industries is that they've been around for a very, very long time and are really playing the long game when it comes to food policy. Just simply being able to delay progressive public health protections is considered a real win for these organizations, because basically the status quo works for them and they want to just keep things the way they are. This is an example of a diagram that appeared in a publication by Dr. Kristen Kearns and colleagues. And she really did a deep investigation of the sugar industry using the Food Industry Documents Library and was very instrumental in launching the archive. This is an example of the Sugar Association's research branch and trade organizations. And as you can see from this timeline, they were founded as early as 1943. And over the years, they've changed and conducted massive amounts of research on the harms of sugar for health. And they know a lot about the product that they produce. And you can see they've changed names, but they've been around for a very, very long time. They know a lot about what sugar, how sugar impacts health. And basically, the current situation works for them, and they would like to keep it that way. And so often advocates, I think, are thinking about the next big win in policy, and not as maybe appreciating as much as we could the long-standing agenda of this industry and how it is shaping these debates over many, many, many decades. Next slide. Another way that the industry documents sort of help you reframe things and think through the lens of industry actors is they bring you around to really appreciating that the food and beverage industry really is not about nation states. It's about regions around the world and the globe and the globe itself. And so when they're thinking about food policy, they're thinking about things like, if Chile passes a front of package labeling law, what will that do to the whole Latin American region? What other countries will decide that that might work? What happens if Mexico passes a soda tax? And you'll hear today in our talks about how important it is to industry actors to prevent the diffusion of policies that would protect public health and that would harm industry interests. This is a paper that Eric Crosby, a professor of public health at the University of Nevada, published using documents and really showing how a lot of the arguments that the industry pulled out around front of package labeling in the Latin American region were driven by many times they knew that these were hollow threats, that threatening to sue a nation state for putting a label on food packaging was really a hollow threat, an argument that they knew wouldn't really stand in court, but could potentially delay the diffusion of that innovation around the Latin American region. So it's important to step back and understand that this is an industry that may be less concerned about what's going on in your country or your locality and more concerned about what's going to happen later on down the line when other countries start modeling themselves on what's going on in your country. Next slide. A third way that industry documents research can help advocates is by helping them to anticipate in a pretty refined way industry's next steps. Next slide. This is a document that is in the DC Leaks collection in the Food Industry Documents Archive. It is an email from a Coca-Cola executive to a lot of other Coca-Cola executives around the world. And it's talking about my home state and a policy debate that I was directly involved in. So that I laughed a little bit when I found this in the archive. Richard Bloom, who's a wonderful assemblyman from Santa Monica, and I worked with closely, appears in this document. It's about a 2-cent per ounce tax that he was about to propose in the legislature. And as you can see, the industry is preparing. The California Beverage Association is leading a response. And so in the Coca-Cola documents, we can identify exactly who the industry actors are leading the charge. Very similar, I was involved in the San Francisco beverage tax debate. The beverage industry spent about $30 million just to fight the tax in San Francisco and the similar one in Oakland. And here's a discussion about that coalition groundwork is underway in Oakland to build early opposition to potential beverage tax proposal. In this case, they were using AstroTurf organizations or fake grassroots organizations to undermine what ultimately was a successful tax. This is just an example of how deep the documents in the archive go, and down to very specific policy debates that you might be involved in, and allowing advocates to anticipate in a very refined way what the next steps might be. Next slide. And then finally, documents research can be really useful in bolstering advocacy campaigns. Documents can be used, quotes from documents can be used. You can, we're going to have a talk today about how journalists have used documents to in advocacy campaigns in food policy. And so there are a lot of ways documents can just be directly woven into advocacy campaigns. Next slide. This is a wonderful report by Vital Strategies, Fool Me Twice. It was a report, an advocacy campaign around the linkages between the tobacco and food and beverage industries. Next slide. Right within a year or two, our team at UCSF published a documents research study in the British Medical Journal on the relationship between the food and beverage industry and the tobacco industry. As it turns out, tobacco corporations starting in the 1960s, including Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds in the United States, systematically bought up beverage lines, including Hawaiian Punch, Kool-Aid, and aggressively marketed these products to children all over the United States and globally, and used even the same advertising firms that developed Joe Camel, which eventually was, the industry was forced to stop using cartoon ads on tobacco products, but they went ahead and developed Punchy for Hawaiian Punch. And so here's a really good example of how documents research can connect to and support and be used by advocates to make their points. In this case, the point that the tobacco playbook and the food and beverage playbook are actually one and the same. Next slide. So to sum up, there are a range of ways that industry documents research, whether it's done by advocates themselves, by journalists, attorneys, or academics, can be used to support food policy advocacy campaigns. It can increase transparency, defining who's who, really exposing front groups that are funded by the industry, industry-funded research. It can help advocates understand the long game and the international global perspective that the industry brings to these debates. It can help in a fairly refined way. Documents can sometimes help you understand what the next steps are that industry is planning. And it can bolster advocacy campaigns in a variety of ways that we're going to see today in the talks illustrated. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Hernando Salcedo Fidalgo is from FIAN Colombia, and Hernando is going to be presenting in Spanish. He's a coordinator in the nutrition branch of FIAN Colombia, and in the fall, Hernando is going to assume a position as the coordinator of the Secretariat at the Civil Society and Indigenous People Mechanism. He'll be presenting in Spanish, so you can use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen if you want to listen in a different language. And translations of his slides will be available after the webinar. So thank you so much, Hernando, for sharing today.
Gracias, Laura.
Thank you so very much, Laura, and thank you for this very kind invitation on behalf of GHAI. I will be presenting a very simple message, which at the same time is a very profound message in terms of the experience when using the FIDA archive by a civil society organization, which is not used to utilizing tools which are usually the path as the search for sources in the area of research, and more specifically, academic research. In this case, in a pragmatic manner, we will share the experience undergone by FIAN Colombia, the hurdles, how this was consolidated, and what is the future when using this archives. Of course, insisting on what Laura said at the beginning, which is that I will continue being a member of FIAN Colombia, but I will not be working directly with the team from October 1st. So this whole experience is open to FIAN Colombia's team using this archive as a tool from now on. All right, so we received a training session on the use of the FIDA archive as members of the Colombian coalition. This coalition groups organizations supported by GHAI, and we were giving this training session through an online course, which allowed us to better understand the impact when using the archive on research and the use of the documents found in this archive through a workshop that lasted 8 weeks. It took place one day every week for 3 hours during the summer of 2021. Of course, this was in the midst of the pandemic, and this online virtual training session involved a lot of effort, and we had to get used to these virtual tools when taking the course. The purpose of the course was to develop the ability to use industry document research to be able to support this process of reforming food policy in Colombia through the actions that FIAN Colombia has been undertaking and will continue to undertaking as far as advocacy actions in Colombia from the perspective of a civil society organization. The context of this training course was, in fact, the context of starting to work on a virtual setting in the midst of the pandemic crisis with a team that was also doing this as part of their work. So one of the criteria for selecting the people who took this training session was to make sure that people could take the course in English. This, of course, is not a condition for using the archive. The webpage can easily be used by anyone when looking for documents, but in principle, this is what allowed people like myself to be able to take these training sessions. Afterwards, and this is what I would like to share today as part of our experience, how we opened this perspective in this scenario so that FIAN Colombia members who had not been in contact with this type of academic research could be able to access the archive, how it worked, and to be able to use it as a tool as part of all of the advocacy strategies. Of course, the institutional capacity of the UCSF library and the researchers were placed at the service of this undertaking. We would like to thank them for this. This whole time was the beginning in an attempt to understand from FIAN Colombia how we could use the archive, how it was possible for us by way of consulting these documents by topics or by the items which as part of public policy had to do with advocacy would enable us to use documents to access experiences like the ones I'm about to share. The problems faced by the FIAN team with respect to the need to use these documents was, in fact, to be able to find evidence which at the beginning was scientific evidence with respect to the political advocacy work in Colombia regarding the consumption of UPPs, advertising the themes that were being established by civil society organizations with respect to public policy regarding the consumption of UPPs. The FIAN Colombia team took on the task of coordinating strategies to be able to craft advocacy actions with respect to Colombian Congress, with respect to priority issues established by the coalition. These topics from 2018 to 2021, specifically 21, were FOPL, for UPPs, healthy school environments, and advertising targeting boys, girls, and adolescents by these corporations that produce these UPPs, and also taxes on sugar sweetened beverages, which today is at the core of the Colombia Coalition advocacy actions and FIAN Colombia's actions. With respect to this, we talked about producing scientific evidence free of conflict of interest. In other words, the issue of conflict of interest was the first topic that brought us together and brought us to the use of this archive, because in the archive, we were able to find documents which revealed, disclosed how corporations had conflict of interest, as we saw in Laura's presentation, and that such conflict of interest was part of one of the possible arguments with respect to the corporations that produce UPPs in Colombia. We also wanted to produce a narrative on this scientific evidence, which was then turned into the core issue by these organizations. And of course, the search for this narrative called for a link to the defense of human rights and the adequate food and nutrition right as well. So the use of the FIDA archive was proposed conceptually as a source. It was something progressive that took place afterwards, after this whole training process at the end of 2021, because the archive, and this is what I would like to show in relation to our experience. It exceptionally provides documentary evidence on the actions of the UPP industry directly. So in the documentary evidence on how the industry was acting in Colombia in terms of their interest, it was possible, partially, not totally, to document this in some of the documents included in the archive. From the use of the archive, it is also possible to craft our own analysis with respect to direct written sources. So this, as a civil society organization, it gives us the possibility to access original documents with a factual and direct evidence. Of course, the fact that the publications showed a new trend regarding the analysis in terms of university research, what euphemistically has been called the political activity of the companies or commercial determinants of health, which allowed us to understand how researchers in the universities use the archive to be able to create these categories of political activity of companies or commercial determinants of health.
Nonetheless, we knew how to do it. And thanks to all the members of the FIAN Colombia team, Let's go to the next slide, please. Here I'm showing you a very brief timeline for you to have an idea of how this work developed and the difficulty to get to the final approval of what we call junk food law in Colombia, which was truly a conquer of the meticulous work and persistence of civil society in alliance with the academia. And precisely when it came out that these tools were a possibility of understanding how the academia worked, but also saying that we as civil society can have a isomorphism, trying to work as the academy does with those files and thus move forward in these strategies. Nonetheless, you see the timeline here, and I highlight all the obstacles that we had along the years back since 2017, and how in 2021, in the summer, this law was passed and signed by the president. Although this is an achievement, the achievement had the challenge of the possibility of applying the law. And this is when the FIDA document started making headway with the topics that I will show you now. In the next slide, please.
Sí, en efecto, en el año
I
2022.
can tell you that back in 2022, we see the need of implementing a collective strategy of using the FIDA file that had been used under the demand of documents from people who had attended the training process. And I made this presentation to Colombia's team, FIAN team, where we introduced the files, we showed them how to use it, and we trained FIAN Colombia members so that the different people directly involved in advocacy work could use these industry documents. So this is what I want to show you now. This first training is of a person who can articulate the dialogue between the university, academia, FIDA documents, and then the transition to civil society is what allowed us building and developing a strategy by training the trainers, which in turn allowed us to use the tools that the industry documents gave us. In the next slide, please. I want to tell you that based on that experience, we built a collective work with a series of quests and searches in the FIDA documents that have allowed us using original documents that support the advocacy policy of FIAN Colombia, but especially related to regional strategies with the also with the political advocacy work vis-a-vis UPPs and vis-a-vis the new project that we will, or that the FIAN team will start in 2022 and 2023. What I want to show you is that by using these FIDA industry documents, we were able to be successful in these aspects. First of all, we were able to do a work on what we call corporate capture of social and political spaces in Colombia. We managed to understand through documents of the industry that there were territories, sectors, fields, and actors that were captured by corporations producing ultra-processed food in Colombia. This in turn allowed us redefining the concept of corporate capture. And this is very important with these industry documents, and this is what we hope to publish very soon to show how we have used the FIDA documents. We developed a tool of an ethical relationship between the industry and social actors in Colombia. What we did was a whole work in that the FIDA documents helped us develop to show that there is a true ethical gap, abyss between corporate actors in Colombia and their places of capture, and that the abyss cannot have linking points or bridges outside areas that have an ethical relationship between these social sectors and the UPP's industry in Colombia. Also, the work in the international arena on companies and human rights, we were able to do a big work of documenting this and redefining the production of knowledge without conflict of interest. Here we have a new definition of corporate capture that I will show you in the next slide. And this is a collective achievement for us in FIAN Colombia in terms of the FIDA use, and something that allows us in exchanging with other researchers. And in the next slide, I will show you the definition of corporate capture in Colombia. And I am going to hand the floor now to Laura for her to continue with the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hernando. Our next speaker is Marisa Macari, and she is the coordinator of nutritional health research at El Poder del Consumidor in Mexico.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you again for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm just going to speak briefly about some of our experiences in Mexico using the industry documents and their relevance for our advocacy work. Are my slides advancing? No. Can you see my slides advancing?
Not yet.
Uh-huh. Let me stop share and just share once more. Apologies. Can you see them now advancing?
Working now, Marisa.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, so just to comment that one of the main barriers we face in advancing food-based policies in Mexico is industry interference. So documenting, monitoring industry interference is really important to us, which is why the industry documents have been so useful to us. And I'm going to speak today about a few of the actions that we take as a civil society organization and some of the ways in which the documents have been used to support these efforts. One, with regard to advancing our priority policies, food policies, in raising awareness among decision makers and the public, in carrying out mass media campaigns and carrying out legal actions on industry wrongdoing. And then some quick conclusions. So with regard to our policies, the sugar sweetened beverage tax and their advocacy efforts to push the sugar sweetened beverage tax, in those efforts, it was very clear that the strategies of the food and beverage industry were immense and exhaustive with regard to the capture of public discourse, media, public opinion, the capture of politics, trying to weaken or block the soda tax measure, and the capture of science. And with regard to all of these elements of sort of corporate capture, the industry documents really did help us. There's a lot in the documents with regard to soda taxes. So it's important to mention that the soda tax was implemented in 2014, but in Mexico, every year it needs to be voted again as part of the budget policy that's voted on every fall. And so just before it was going to be voted on again, we saw this outpouring of industry-funded studies to draw doubt on the independent study showing the effectiveness of the tax. These industry studies used discursive strategies to suggest that the tax hadn't been successful. This was right before the budget was going to be approved again. Now, luckily for us, at the same time, this article came out of the industry document that was showing that from the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the research, the sugar research, or the Sugar Foundation funded by the sugar industry was trying to minimize the relationship between sugar and coronary heart disease. So all these documents are present in the archive. And this gave us this really long view of showing the media and decision makers, look, what's happening in Mexico in terms of funding science, industry funded science, happened in the 50s, in the 60s. So, this is part of a larger strategy of the industry. And we were able to have a variety of press conferences, and my slides are not advancing, press conferences, Laura Schmidt was able to come down, and at the end, when that budget passed, the tax was not reduced. There was no, challenge to the soda tax, and it continued to be implemented. But using sort of these industry documents to show the impact of industry-funded science and it as sort of a larger coordinated strategy of the industry was very important for us. My slides have stopped advancing again. I apologize. I'm going to share them again, and perhaps just, can you see them?
It's working fine.
Okay. And so following this incident, also related to this sort of, the tax had already been implemented, but again, it was just up for it to be re-voted on in the annual budget package in Congress. ELC, the Ripley Institute, ELC, which Laura has already mentioned, brought down scientists to Mexico, created this conference on sweeteners to show that sugar, or to suggest that sugar was not what the, sugar sweetened beverages should not be taxed, that this was not going to be an effective health strategy, and that sugar was not the problem, it was really calories. And we were able to kind of draw on the documents that had already come out, for example, this whole fiasco with the Global Energy Balance Network, and the New York Times article that had just come out literally weeks before this big fiasco in Mexico. We were able to mention these in press conferences and press releases to say, listen, this is happening internationally, and it's happening in Mexico too. And then later on, we had these ILSI documents, which also were mentioned by Laura, based on the Freedom for Information, request for information from US Right to Know. Now these documents are in the archive, and these documents really help to delegitimize ELC and to help to ensure that ELC is not a problem for our current policy objectives and efforts, because it has been delegitimized so much because of these articles based on documents in the archive. And so we did a variety of press releases as well based on those ILC documents. Another document coming out of the archive, or using documents from the archive, is this article by Andrea Pedrosa and colleagues, which really tells the story in the industry's own words of the funding of science to delegitimize the tax in Mexico, and the funding of conferences and funding of scientists to also draw doubt on the fact that the tax was working in Mexico. And so this document, although came out after our soda tax efforts, this document, I think, can be really crucial for other advocates pushing soda tax in their localities or even other food-related policies, because it tells so clearly the story of industry interference in science and in policy processes. I also wanted to bring attention just to some of our work with industry documents to raise awareness more generally. We've used the documents a lot to create sort of this focal point on which we can create and elevate discussion in the media among the public about the use of industry financed science, industry lobbying to derail public health policies. And so we created this little mini series of videos called the Junk Food Files, in which we have various chapters, some of which focus on really diluting for a general audience the findings of the documents and the articles published from the industry document archive with regard to ELC, the coronary heart disease article that I mentioned before. These kind of put them in the context of Mexico, but draw on that greater literature to kind of create sort of this canon and referring back to these important studies to make it really obvious the evidence base that the industry is influencing science and policy. And we also did little mini videos with interviews with Laura Schmidt as well, where she talks about the strategies of the industry. Now, moving on to a third action, mass media campaigns. One of the mass media campaigns, well, actually our most recent one put out this year, is the slogan in English is "Take care of your health, take care of the planet." This was our campaign image. This was the document that went along with it. And the idea of this was basically to draw attention to the fact that ultra-processed foods are not only bad for health, but they're also bad for the environment, in particular because of their use of plastics, the life cycle of plastics, and plastics pollution. So we wanted to draw attention to this idea that they have this impact on health, but also the environment. And what we did was, because we know in the public discourse, and we knew a lot of the pushback we get was the industry publicly talks about a lot of their efforts to help the environment as stewards of the environment and of their recycling efforts. So we wanted to kind of pull back the veil and see what was really happening. And so we went back to this now really infamous document that's in the industry archives, where it talks about it's a policy matrix. It talks about the different policies that Coca-Cola Europe is monitoring. And we see very interesting here is that in the little boxes of fight back and prepare, we see that the industry is actually working on fighting back or preparing to fight back against some of the restrictions on the use of plastic, extended producer responsibility, all these sorts of regulations, restrictions that would put limits on the production of plastics. So meanwhile, publicly, they're talking about their efforts on recycling. Privately, we see they are monitoring and looking to fight back against the policies that, that would impact their plastic. So this is interesting also on another level, and these are some, just flip through some of these really important documents in the archive that you can kind of keep coming back to depending on what policy effort you're working on, to see what the industry is sort of game plan was, as Laura was mentioning, and to get a bird's eye view as to their strategy. So many of these documents are really chock full with, and they allow you to see that the industry is not only monitoring health policies and well-being policies, they are monitoring policies on tax, on trade, on sustainability, on plastics, and it gives you just an overview of how deep their reach goes in terms of lobbying policies in the public interest. And so I will finish with just one last document that is in the archive, or based on documents in the archive. There was an article published that was very useful for one of our efforts that we carried out recently this month. A legal action was placed, a legal claim against a campaign of Coca-Cola in Mexico. The campaign is called Love Multiplies. And the idea was, it's really a corporate social responsibility campaign in which they talk about all the good Coca-Cola has done for the environment, for women, for communities, and for water, in terms of water conservation. And this El Poder del Consumidor, along with Greenpeace and COA Nutrition, an organization in Mexico, denounced and once removed this campaign because they suggest that it's really false advertising, and it's trying to draw the consumer away from all the harm that their products, Coca-Cola's products, are causing on health and the environment, using this sort of corporate social responsibility rhetoric and sort of beautiful images, suggesting kind of all the contrary to what they're actually doing behind the scenes. And really just discussing how this is a form of indirect marketing that allows and really creates consumer loyalty, especially among some of the communities that are most marginalized in Mexico and most affected by the effects of Coca-Cola's products. And one of the documents in the archive is so interesting because it talks about some of the behind the scenes strategizing of the tobacco industry that was then transferred to the food industry. This use of kind of trying to gain consumer loyalty, especially among more marginalized groups and racial ethnic minorities, for their products by carrying out these corporate social responsibility activities, by connecting and sponsoring organizations in the community to try to clean up their image. And so this was one of the articles that was very useful in making the case for how corporate social responsibility is really a form of indirect marketing. and one that allows you to kind of get closer and to create loyalty among certain groups of consumers. So in conclusion, I want to mention that the documents really in general help to raise awareness for industry interference at the national and global level. They reveal the distinction between food, the private versus the public discourse. And they're very politically powerful because it allows you to say in the industry's own words, to show the industry's intentions in their own words. And that is very moving to move the needle on certain policy issues because it really gets the attention of policymakers and decision makers. And the evidence from the archive really in most general terms strengthens the case for the need for implementing safeguards against industry interference and policymaking. And the documents really give you that bird's eye view. They help to give you a very clear understanding of the global agenda, of the coordinated efforts, of the coordinated associations and organizations and front groups working together on these issues, and helps to allow advocates to be a bit preemptive to understand kind of where the industry is going next. And that's it. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for your time.
So next up, we're going to have Laís Amaral. And Laís is a nutritionist and technical supervisor of the Healthy and Sustainable Diets program at the Brazilian Institute for Consumer Defense, Idec, where she's worked since 2016. Laís?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to share my screen. If you can let me know if it's working, I appreciate it.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm here representing a team of researchers. I'll talk about the investigation that we did in the FIDA archive and about the case of the Brazilian dietary guidelines and the NOVA food classification system. So I'm representing here 4 institutions, 4 researchers: Camila Maranha from ACT Health Promotion, Valéria Buriti from FIAN Brazil, Melissa Mialon from NUPENS, from the University of São Paulo, and myself. So just to give you a context about the Brazilian dietary guidelines, so it was implemented here in Brazil in 2014, and it's a very important document for the food policies here in the country because it broke the paradigm about the focus on the macro and micronutrients. And it changed for the level and aim of the processing of the foods. So this is the NOVA classification system. It classifies the food in natura or fresh food, processed food, or an ultra processed food that should be avoided. And also it talks about sustainability, commensality, that's new also in a dietary guideline, and especially the ultra processed food concept that is the main news from this guideline. And it was very used to base other dietary guidelines all over the world. And because of that, of course, the industry is not happy with the Brazilian dietary guidelines, especially with the NOVA classification system. So this resulted in some strategies and some actions from the industry or from researchers and institutions, even including the institutions inside the government that worked with the big food and big soda industries. So here we have some materials and some articles from the press. This is Carlos Monteiro. He is the researcher who developed the NOVA classification system that is used in the Brazilian dietary guidelines. So it's not news that he's very attacked all the time, him and the NOVA classification system, because of the ultra-processed food concept. We have a lot of documents from the industry or from the ITAU is a government institute, and it's really they released this industrialized foods to talk about the importance of the industrialized foods in Brazil. And in 2020, it was in September of 2020, the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Supply in Brazil released this technical note about the Brazilian dietary guidelines, criticizing the NOVA classification system, and talking about how it's not based on scientific evidence, and how it's punitive, how it's not helping consumers to choose their food and beverages. This technical note recommended the revision of the Brazilian dietary guidelines. Also, we had a lot of events, webinars, articles released in the press from the industry, especially from the food engineer, talking about how the NOVA classification system is like fake, because of the industrialized food products are important, and the food processing is important. And so this is processed foods, fake food or fake news. And here is the NOVA classification system under the vision of the food engineering. So this is just an example of the events and webinars that were happening at that time. And internationally, the Brazilian dietary guidelines and the NOVA classification system are also criticized. Some of you probably know Susanna and Michael here. So they talk about the food processing, defending the food processing and against the NOVA classification system. And here it is a scientific paper from Melissa Mialon and colleagues about the criticism of the NOVA classification system, trying to know who are the researchers and people who are criticizing it. And it shows a lot of conflicts of interest, of course. So against that technical note from the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Supply, the day after its publication, many researchers and many civil society organizations worked for to talk about the problems in this technical note. So this was the note from NUPENS, where Carlos Monteiro is the coordinator. So also the Alliance for Health and Adequate and Health Diets here in Brazil, that is the biggest alliance regarding food and nutrition, released a manifest in defense of the Brazilian dietary guidelines. So this was the how we worked against the technical note. And also in 2021, from May to September, we released this mass media campaign to disseminate the Brazilian dietary guidelines and to protect it, to disclosure it for the general population, So we had a website and a lot of materials and all over the press. So based on that, and since the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines is a very important document that is basing all of our actions regarding the food policy program and all of our actions inside our organizations, we decided to search for documents in the FIDA archive about it. So we started searching for the names of important people related to the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines and the NOVA classification system, researchers, industry professionals, some terms, of course, Brazilian Dietary Guidelines, NOVA classification, industrialized food processing, and some important institutions, mainly the opponents of the concept and the guidelines. So we get some results from it. We used the way that the UCSF told us about the terms here. So we had some documents, and the main document that we got regarding the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines is this one. So we had the link here. It's from 2016. It was found in the collection DC Leaks Coca-Cola emails, so in the Coca-Cola leaks. And so it was email from the Global Vice President of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs for his team regarding a specific document that is this one. So the top policy issues, and here they talk about many issues, and I'm going to show you some part of the sugar, low and non-caloric sweeteners and sweetnesses. So this one was referring to the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines, especially about the risk of the negative dietary guidelines. So that's how they refer to the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines. So here is the part of the text that we found, the specific terms that we were searching. So in the part of Brazil issued national dietary guidelines in 2015 that are punitive to sugar and our beverages, classifying them as ultra-processed foods. So they talk about some efforts, some about the reducing sugar from their part, from Coca-Cola, but this is how they classified the guidelines here. So this document talks about a lot of other issues, including the front of package labeling, for example, and it's a global view. So it's not only for Brazilians, it's especially the Latin America is all over the document. And so how did we use this? How did we disclose this? So the document was sent by one of the researchers to an investigative journalist here in Brazil. The document was fully read by this journalist who wrote the article. It was prioritized to the publication, and the publication was also used the document, but also interviews and talked about the history about the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines attacks and the NOVA classification system attacks too. So we got 2 articles released on the press. So this one was the first one in the Intercept Brazil. So it's Coca-Cola document in the US lists the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines as a threat. And the second, and it got over 40,000 views by that time. So probably more now. Here is the link for the article, and it talks about all the document. So it's 155 pages and 6 heat map as the one I showed for you about the sugar. So we had more about other subjects, and the other The other article was in the O Joio e o Trigo, that is investigative journalist website. The name of the article is "In a Document to Coca-Cola in the US, a consulting company lists the Brazilian dietary guidelines as a problem." This had over 13,000 views by that time. And it's interesting to know the timeline, because our mass media campaign to protect and to promote the Brazilian dietary guidelines was ongoing when the articles were released. So it worked as a complement to the mass media campaign. And the mass media campaign resulted in more than 100,000 subscribers. So we have this these emails, these contacts to work and to protect the Brazilian dietary guidelines with them. And the mass media campaign resulted in this newsletter that is called Tá na Mesa. It's working since February in this year, and we had more than now 33 editions of the newsletter. It's every week we release one of them, and it talks about health and sustainable diets, mainly always based on the Brazilian dietary guidelines and its concepts and the policies and everything. So actually the articles were a complement to the campaign that we were doing back then, and we are still doing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Laís. So this has been really interesting for me, hearing the three sequential presentations. And Hernando's, what struck me was the idea of, he took a training at UCSF and then wound up training people in his own organization to use the archive to increase the capacity of the organization to use the materials. In Marisa's talk, I really was impressed by the way the archive was used to expose the gap between what the industry was saying in its corporate social responsibility campaigns and its marketing, and then what they were saying about those very same issues like environment behind the scenes. Huge contrast. And then in Laís's presentation, I was really struck by, I mean, just how defensive advocates have to be. And same with Marisa's. Just because you have the law passed doesn't mean that it's not under threat. And your organization so strategically used the documents to defend the NOVA classification by exposing the people who were set up by the industry to criticize it. And then you also used the SRA Sandcroft consulting document to anticipate, actually found that they were how they were going to attack the dietary guidelines. So a very strategic use of the archive. And on this issue of defending these policies, you know, I've been struck by just a change of administration in the UK, and the sugar tax is now under threat. I would not have anticipated that policy, which has a lot of research backing it up, would be under threat, but it is. So just because the policy's passed doesn't mean that the industry isn't going to kind of try to contain the diffusion or reverse it. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and please, people on the webinar, feel free to ask any questions that you have. You can just put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I want to start by asking you a little bit about, have you directly shared your findings from your research in the archive with policymakers? And if you have, how have they responded to this kind of information? Marisa, I was struck a little bit by, I mean, does El Poder del Consumidor, do you actually package results from the industry documents in your advocacy campaigns? And how do those make their way to policymakers in Mexico?
Sure, of course they do. Yes, in our campaigns and our press releases and our press conferences, we often invite decision makers or in meetings or documents that are distributed to members of Congress. For example, with regard to the soda tax, there was a document distributed to Congress members mentioning that, you know, despite what the industry says, the tax has been effective. And in those, it was sort of like a folder with a variety of documents. And of course, in there, actually, there was a big image of that policy matrix talking about the industry fighting against the soda tax, as well as mentions of the article by Kristen Kearns and colleagues, and talking about how this is a long-standing strategy of the industry to fund science that discounts the independent research. So yes, it has definitely made it into the hands of policymakers. And then also just with the warning label and other policies that we're working on now, using that evidence, for example, the document by Andrea Pedrosa, you and colleagues, has also been a way to say to policymakers, look, there needs to be safeguards against industry interference in policy making because
do you find that over time policymakers become educated so that when ILSI Mexico comes knocking at the door, they actually know who they're talking to, that they know that these are industry funded scientists and lobbyists?
Yes, absolutely. It becomes kind of shorthand because you're like, remember, you know, the press conference and the article and the experts talking about this a few years ago, same thing's happening. It becomes much easier to talk about it and for people and for it to be denormalized.
Thanks. Another question I have is, you know, you, Marisa, mentioned your latest campaign is really connecting the dots between the impact of ultra-processed foods on human health, but also on the environment, on plastics pollution, water scarcity, and other issues. And I'm wondering, Laís and Hernando, have the campaigns and the work in your countries also thought about connecting the dots between human health and environment? Or have you stayed really focused on the health aspect?
We did a mass media campaign about the food industry interference here in Brazil this year. And we talked especially about the soda industry. And we used the health issues, but also the plastic, the sustainability of, or non-sustainability of that. So we tried to use all the elements to show how the industry works and the problems that they are doing here in our policies and in the health and the environment as a whole.
Yeah, it just seems with people really starting to experience the effects of climate change, that this is a real opportunity for advocates in the food space to be making those connections. You know, I was interested, Laís, it was so amazing how your research in the documents wound up making such an impact in the media in Brazil. And I'm wondering, how do you go about pitching your findings to a reporter and getting journalists interested in publishing this material and getting it out to the public?
Yes, I think that we had a contact with this specific investigative journalist. So this was easier. And I think we have to take advantage of the situations. But I think also in this case, specific case, it was something that should be released right away because it was important by the time. And so I think it's a way to do that is to find the journalists or the press that is related to your issue, or they is interested in policies regarding food or health. So here in Brazil, we have a list of them. I think it's harder, especially if it's not super new, to talk about the biggest press. So this is a challenge, but I think it depends on the document, depends on the news that you have. So for this situation, this specific situation, we found this more effective to talk to someone that we knew already, and a specific press that is related to this kind of subject.
Okay, so another question for all three of you. What do you see as the archive's greatest potential in terms of how advocates can use it? And also, what do you see as its greatest weakness? What do you think have been has been the level of legitimacy for advocates with the archive? Do you have any experiences with the archive in terms of communications?
Yo quisiera responderle a Laura.
I would like to answer Laura a bit differently, because as I explained, the process within FIAN Colombia has been intended to understand how the archive works and being able to use it and see where we can use it under what scenarios. What we have seen as a difficulty here is how to access documents directly related to certain topics in Colombia. This is an effort which, as part of the tradition of academic research, could be done more easily. But as a civil society organization, we need to find the clues to be able to cross the categories that will allow us to find such documents. But they are there, of course. And one first way to start feeding this process is that when we found clues or documents or sections where the archive can also be fed, then we may be able to come in contact with you to be able to contribute and to provide these documents on one hand. And on the other hand, this is what we have been doing this whole time, trying to understand that with respect to certain issues, we may find some categories with which we can work within the archive. This is what we're doing as we speak regarding issues that have to do, for instance, with the code of ethics, corporate capture, and some specific issues that have to do with corporate capture particularly. But we have to talk about this dual relationship between academia and civil society through the use of the archive. And by the way, I'd like to say that, for instance, in Colombia, we don't talk about UPPs because they're not food. They are just products. They are food products. So this is just on the side. I don't know if I was clear in the way in which we can continue to feed the archive and to start working based on a two-way relationship, also working with the other organizations as well.
Yes, and Hernando, that's a really important point. Sometimes people in the advocacy world come upon documents, whether through Freedom of Information Act requests, through litigation, and we're always excited to talk to people who would like to donate documents to the archive. It's a public good. It's available to everyone. And if you come across documents and when you're done using them, please feel free to reach out to archivists at the library if you have materials that you think might be useful to others and could be donated to the archive. You can just see on the website, there's information on how to reach the librarians who manage the archive. So thank you for suggesting that. I guess I have just a closing question about how do you plan to use these materials going forward in your work? As you know, what are the issues in your countries that are emerging, and how are you thinking about using the archive going forward? Hernando, you mentioned, for example, there are folks at your organization who are now really have been trained in how to use the archive. And so is it about monitoring the issues that you've discussed today, or is it about new policy agendas? How do you anticipate using these materials going forward?
Puedo responder rápido para
I
dejar.
can answer very quickly to give the floor to my colleagues. Well, we have an agenda with corporate capture included in our agenda so that people who are working on advocacy regarding corporate capture will be using and are using the archive in an attempt to identify sectors, categories, and documents that relate to this. On the other hand, when it comes to the ethical relationship code, a possible issue that is coming up, that is emerging clearly, is the capture of civil society in terms of movements that appear to be global movements. I could mention one here very quickly, where we have to start looking into how through the archive we may be able to identify specific documents about these issues. We have an agenda.
So really looking at the corporate capture of civil society, that sounds like a very important place to go. Marisa?
Yeah, I think one of the important issues moving forward, where even though some of the articles in the document in the archive are a little older, they are already thinking about these issues that I would say only now are becoming a little more a priority for some civil society members, for example, with the passage of the front of pack warning labels, and of course the soda tax, working on marketing policies, the idea of low and no calorie sweeteners as a replacement for sugar is a big one, and it's a really important one. And in the industry documents, there are articles, or rather documents, emails, and reports that link back to that and the risks that the industry do see with regard to this shift towards low and no calorie sweeteners. So I think that's an important one moving forward. And also to say that there's always new documents being uploaded. And like I saw that just this month, there were some more articles and emails being uploaded. And when you put in the same search terms, you find different things. So that's also something to think about moving forward.
Yes, that's a really good point. We're always updating the archive. There's also a publications list in the archive, and you can search that to see papers that academics are publishing. So there's a lot of, and on the artificial sweeteners front, I think that's a very important issue going forward, because as the public becomes more aware of the health harms of sugar, there's a push in the industry to reformulate and to put a lot of artificial sweeteners, particularly into children's beverages. And so I agree with you that that's a really important policy issue going forward. Is that really the way we want reformulation to be happening? So Laís, any closing thoughts?
Yes, Laura.
In the future?
Yeah, I think we worked with a specific question in this specific case for the Brazilian dietary guidelines. And I think this is a very good way to find something interesting, other than like, we have a lot of documents. So if you have a specific question, I think it helps a lot. And I agree 100% with Marisa about the documents that are not very new, but they show that the articulation of the food industry, and they are always a step ahead. It looks like that. So I think we should take advantage of the documents to know what are the next steps, and to plan our work on that. And something very interesting that we found is that in the document that I showed, it's the global strategy, and with a focus on the Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think our region can use it a lot to work on the food policies. And regarding the food policies, I think they are all very related with the others, the Hernando and the Marisa's food policies also. So the food labeling, the food marketing, the food taxation, the institutional environments such as schools and hospitals and others. And also, as Marisa said, all the food policies have consequences, and one of them is the food reformulation. So not only look at the ultra-processed food products as a whole, but the sweeteners, all the other additives, the food additives. So it's a thing that we can take a look. And one thing that is very important for us as a strategy is to use the documents to expose the industry, the arguments, the tactics, and to do and by that to sensitize the policymakers about the issue and the society as well, because this is a very hard topic to talk about, and it's very the brands here in Brazil have a lot of power, so it's hard to talk about the potential issues related to the products and to the actions that the industry is doing. So I think we have to take advantage of that.
Well, I want to thank you all for sharing your research today and for the amazing work that you do every day. I really appreciate it. And for the and so I want to thank the audience for joining us today. And please fill out the webinar survey. And thank you very much. Have a good day.